Hello everybody. So this is our last video for social theory, and today we're going to talk a little bit about feminist theory. So there are three different, what are referred to often as waves of feminist theory. Now, they're still referred to as waves. There's a little bit, like initially that happens because there's different political movements, and often feminist theory is tied to these political movements. So there's three different periods where feminist theory becomes particularly influential in politics. The first being in the late 1800s, early 20th century, the second being in the 60s, and then lastly being in the late 80s, early 90s. And since then we've kind of had usually the same forms of feminism that came from the other three waves. There hasn't been as much changes to feminism after that. So that's where the idea of there being waves of feminism come from. When it comes to theory, they use that language, but it becomes kind of muddled. And the reason why is because a lot of the ideas of previous waves of feminism are still extremely influential, as we'll see as we move forward. So, even though I'm going to call them waves, we're generally going to think about waves more as a grouping of them, right? There are similarities amongst things that would be identified as being first wave feminism, second wave feminism, or third wave feminism. Okay, so one of my taglines I like to say is that there's a weird reaction to the word feminism, and to kind of get into the mind of feminist theory, I think we kind of have to overcome that. So a lot of people are slow to identify with feminism. You are probably already some sort of feminism. There's very few people who aren't. If you think women should have the right to vote, you're a feminist. You're just a liberal feminist. You're a first wave feminist. So if you think women should be able to own property, you're a feminist. That's once again a form of liberal feminism, which gets us to our first wave. So our first wave, there are four major issues and four major sets of ideas, things that people talk about in first wave feminism. The first is what we just described there, is liberal feminism. So when first wave feminism first occurs, women are not allowed to own property and they're not allowed to vote. And those things are overcome by the suffragist movement, which is our first sort of version of writing about feminism. And basically what happens is most of that's focused on the equality of women, in terms of women being equally human, being equally capable. These would have been radical ideas in their own time. Women would have at that time very much so been thought of as mentally inferior, as less rational. And we still hear these things today. So there's still forms of anti-feminism, if you will, that sound that way. So that's our first two of those issues of the first wave. Then often first wave feminism is also focusing on either prohibition or the repeal of the Comstock Law. So the temperance movement is combined with first wave feminism, and that often is seeking to alter the place of drugs within society, in particular viewing alcohol use as a sort of male-centric culture that often steals money from women and children. And so the temperance movement is combined with that. Less focus on that today, often coming from feminists, but at the time it was really important within feminist thought. And then lastly is the repeal of something called, and this is particularly in the United States, the repeal of something called the Comstock Laws. So ideas revolving around the repeal of Comstock Laws is essentially what happens is that in the early 20th century and late 19th century, it's illegal to not only use forms of birth control, but also to talk about it as a doctor, even if it's a health issue. So even if somebody's would be, you know, at danger of dying if they became pregnant, it would have been illegal for doctors, often with fairly lengthy prison sentences attached to it, illegal for doctors to mention birth control. So the Comstock laws and the repealing of the Comstock laws and basically women's health becoming something that's possible to talk about. You could literally couldn't talk about reproduction; it was considered profanity, and protected by those laws. Was one of the major goals of first wave feminism. So so if we're to map out, our first wave of feminism is a combination of theoretical ideas having to do with the equality of women, the owning of property, the ability to vote, and birth control. Okay. So there we go. That's our first sort of version of feminism. First wave feminism, liberal feminism, and sort of anti or pro-birth control sort of stuff. Okay, our second wave of feminism is far more theoretical. It's a little less it's political, but political in a very different way. It's tied up in a lot of the sort of political theoretical conversations of the 1960s and 70s. So it's a far more theoretically undergirded form of politics. And it moves away from its model being sort of liberal democratic politics to various other things. So I actually gave you two different readings that were a part of this second wave of feminism. One would be an example of something called radical feminism, and the second being Marxist feminism. Although some of the last end of that chapter is actually third wave. So the form of radical feminism that we see is the work I gave you by Shulamith Firestone. Shulamith Firestone is one of the major thinkers within radical feminism. Radical feminism generally views women's oppression as having a biological basis. So women are oppressed by the fact, and here you see one of the themes from first wave feminism carrying through, particularly the idea of stuff about birth control. So in radical feminism, what you see is that women being forced by their biology into the role of mother and child care person is mainly how women are oppressed. So women are literally oppressed by their own bodies, which they view men as taking advantage of. So women are forced into reproducing what's called reproductive labor. Women are forced into basically this sort of homemaker life. Shulamith Firestone views technology as being capable of altering this relationship, but has been, in essence, controlled by male patriarchy, so that it doesn't exist. So that technology in the form of like women can now control their reproduction, as well as sort of like we could rearrange society. And a lot of what Shulamith Firestone wants to do is set up a different way of arranging society that's no longer based on nuclear families and having children. So because of our sort of technological society, we could form these sort of like collective societies where reproduction happens differently. And Shulamith Firestone would even argue that men and women should probably, to some degree, have some of a separatist mentality, living apart, working apart. This is, and so one of the reasons why I assigned Shulamith Firestone is I think you get out of radical feminism and you get out of Shulamith Firestone sort of the scare story of what feminist theory is. So I think that most people, when they have something in mind, they have radical feminism. Radical feminism isn't actually all that popular anymore. Third wave feminism sort of takes radical feminism to task, and you don't get as much of it as you used to. It slowly gets replaced by other things. Partially this focus on the women's biology, then also this sort of like very strong, like we need to, this sort of like almost if you will, like apartheid system of removing women from men. All these things get sort of become less popular. So But I think when most people, especially when people are afraid of feminism, like that's what they get in their head is Shulamith Firestone, the radical feminism. Also, so that's one variant of second wave feminism. Another variant that we see, and what's probably more influential today, are forms of Marxist feminism. So Marxist feminism is going to be less focused on sort of like politics, voting rights, women representation, getting things through women through, you know, creating of interest groups within democratic politics. And this is going to focus on mostly market relationships. And I'll give you an example of one of these. So one of the areas of Marxist feminism that was written about a lot, particularly in the 1970s, was something called the separate spheres argument. And the separate spheres argument essentially talked about the way in which we value labor in society. So we have a tendency to undervalue women's labor. So this can take the form of the fact that, like, most of you probably have heard this, that like regardless of the amount that women work or their performance, they will get paid less than men and promoted less than men. And that would be an example of sort of like a very obvious undervaluing of women's labor. Quite literally, like, we become blind to women's labor. A lot of this has to do with the way that women are trained culturally to be more passive than men. So they are less likely to make a big stir about the work that they do. So they have a tendency to, like, if women's work is done well, everyone is blind to it because essentially they just sort of set things up and it works well. If everything goes well, people don't recognize that women are working. And that's true in actual, like, workplaces as well. But it's even more true if we think about other forms of labor. Particularly getting back to the idea of reproductive labor. So this is actually a fight between radical and Marxist feminists. So if we take somebody like Shulamith Firestone, she has a tendency to devalue the work that women do in reproductive labor, having children, taking care of children, taking care of spouses. And really what Marxist feminists wants to say is we actually don't place enough value on the things that women are doing. We become blind to that. And you can see that in the fact that, like, if we think about work, we often only really value work that you get paid for culturally. That being paid acknowledges the same thing with, like, we have a tendency to view volunteer work as something almost a little silly sometimes, and talk about it that way. Like, real work is getting paid. Getting paid proves that you're worth something. And in that way, like, women are often removed from pay. We don't acknowledge that women actually produce tons of wealth with their work. In other words, historically, throughout time, women have done the necessary labor to allow men to go off and work. This isn't always true. This accompanies modernity. So if we go back before modernity, women and men work in the same spaces. So if we think about the archetype of, like, I don't know, somebody farming, right? Women are going to be raising families out of the house, raising the family out of the house. Men are going to be coming in and out of the home, going out and working in the fields, but they're all together, right? So women's late work becomes very obvious. So women's work isn't quite as undervalued historically as it becomes in modernity, or if you're using it even more Marxist language, as it does under capitalism. So capitalism alters the way in which people work. And so starting in the 1800s, you have people going and working in factories, and you have the death of sort of like home industries. So even if you weren't a farmer, even if you were a linen weaver or a blacksmith or whatever, right? You generally did that as a form of something called cottage industry, which means you worked out of your home. And so the work of women and the work of men occurred in the same sphere, right? Even business people would generally conduct their business out of homes. You think of landed aristocrats, right? If you want to do business with an aristocrat, it's done at the mansion or at somebody else's mansion, right? And generally you think about, like, the family is with them. So the family sphere and the work sphere are not separate things, but in modernity, things move to the factory, they move to the office, and all of a sudden people become blind to all this labor that's done by women that goes into reproducing people. So I used the term a couple times already, reproductive labor. So what is reproductive labor? Women are generally in charge of, and this is still true to this day, generally in charge of maintaining the lives of people around them. Basically our biological needs as human beings are primarily taken care of by women. Women do more of the housework, the cooking, the cleaning, right? So in that way we're fed by women. And when we talk about child rearing, even though things are more equal than they used to be, if you actually take the amount of time that people spend child rearing, women spend exorbitant more amount of time. So quite literally, each generation is reproduced, right, one after another, primarily through labor by women, but none of this labor is recognized. So all reproductive labor gets viewed as sort of like an extra or a little thing, but in reality, women work significantly more than men. Actually, women work the most. We just have a tendency to be blind to the contributions of women. So in sort of like the separate spheres world of Marxism, what they're going to see is they're going to make this claim that, to some degree you have men, and they feel like they're doing everything because they get paid for their labor, but they work less hours, they make more demands, they feel more entitled, they spend more money, they live higher on the hog than everybody else in their family. So in a lot of ways, without even trying to, men have a tendency to dominate over their families in a way that's extremely exploitative. Once again, this isn't like men are bad, right? This is that structurally, right, we've created this system that divorces men and women out and disacknowledges women's labor and makes the lives easier for men. And as somebody, it's hard to overcome these things. So we've lived, at least for a generation and a half, maybe 2 generations of particularly upper middle class people trying to be more equal in their labor, but there's still a lot of training into how we behave as men and women that go into it, and the amount of care that you're supposed to give really kind of affects the amount of care that you sorry, somebody's working on something in the basement. It totally distracted me. I have a plumber downstairs. Anyways, so where was I? So gender training, yeah. So the amount of care and the performance of certain tasks women are trained to do very early on and men are not, right? So even when you try to be equal in the household, I'll give myself as an example, and this is me being embarrassed about this, right? But I wasn't trained very well into doing housework. So I will vacuum the carpet, but I won't do as good of a job as Amanda can. I will clean surfaces and dust, and I can do all those things, and I'm willing to do all those things, but I don't do them as well. And often she will have to go back and look over it, and stuff like that. And so here you see kind of this sort of embedded gender difference. It's very difficult to overcome over time as a result of the separate spheres. So those are the first 2 examples. Okay, our third wave feminism is largely a critique of these other forms of feminism. So the third wave, rather than just being a sort of different focus for for second wave feminists, it's a different focus from first wave. It doesn't necessarily critique first wave feminism, where third wave feminism very much so is a critique of what comes before it. And you had in your the chapter from Man, so it started in its analysis of Marxist feminists with very much the second wave feminist sort of stuff, but towards the end you get third wave feminism starting to seep in. One example of this would be standpoint epistemology. So standpoint epistemology has its roots in Hegel, who we talked about at the beginning, and particularly an idea within Hegel referred to as the master-slave dialectic. In the master-slave dialectic, Hegel's image is basically like if you had somebody who's a servant of somebody else. Who's wiser? And so we would make the basic assumption on the basis of sort of capital and the way in which we present people and the prestige of their positions that a master is greater than his slave. But Hegel wants to question that. And the way he wants to question that is he wants to say, well, when a master makes a decision, who does he have to think about? Well, he only has to think about himself. So the master is caught in his own consciousness. He only sees the world through his own eyes. But the slave cannot think of the world only through his own eyes. He has to see the world also through the eyes of his master. Right? So in this way, like, a slave has to see himself as both a subject, a person acting, making decisions, utilizing his free will, and an object, right? The way in which his master would look at him. The slave has a dual consciousness. So in that way, he has, like, you can use this in a positive or a negative way. So W.E.B. Du Bois, the racial theorist, uses this in a negative way. And he wants to claim that people have a bifurcated consciousness, right? So they never feel whole or complete. A lot of feminist theory instead wants to use this in a very positive way. And it wants to be like, no, what it means is that, and this is how Hegel would use it as well, what it means is that a slave becomes more well-rounded and has a better understanding of his situation in the world and understands how society works better than his master can. That this dual consciousness gives him a privileged position within society for understanding social structure. So feminist standpoint epistemology wants to claim that something very similar happens with women, something very similar happens with race, right? A lot of this grows out of, a lot of standpoint epistemology stuff grows out of black feminism. And it's quite literally that there's a privileged position for black women in understanding the in and outs of social structure, particularly in the United States, right? Because they're both a racialized other, and a genderized other, and they're capable of seeing, right, the world through both dominant groups and those who submit to them. So that's one example of a third wave feminism. It becomes a critique of other forms of feminism and not acknowledging various forms of difference. So particularly Patricia Hill Collins, talks about these sort of matrices of domination. And that, like, to understand, right, and this often gets referred to as intersectionality. To understand one form of difference, gender, you have to understand it through another, race, class, right? And where people sit on these intersections, right? What's their standpoint within social structure, and how does that guide and change their worldview? And without acknowledging this, right, you end up replicating certain forms of inequality while arguing or trying to help with others. So standpoint epistemology becomes a critique of second wave feminism, in particular in only acknowledging there being male and female. They actually end up becoming a way of supporting racialized and class differences. And you see this in the separate spheres argument. The separate spheres argument, to some degree, assumes that women are working at home, stay-at-home mothers. This is not the experience of lower class and African American women, a lot of which would like to stay home and be with their children, but instead what they have to do is they have to go off and work, often raising other people's children, often raising upper middle class white children, right? Particularly if you're thinking about like Hispanic populations in the Southwest. For pay, when they would prefer to be home if they had enough money to be able to do that. So the second spheres argument is in its way a reflection of privilege according to standpoint epistemology. So that's kind of one example. Another big example is the tension between a form of second wave feminism we haven't talked about yet, which is victim feminism, and critiques of victim feminism from the third wave, which there's a lot of different versions of this. So victim feminism focuses on, quite literally, women's victimization. So a lot of the stuff that you hear about things like, things like sexual discrimination and things of that nature are victim feminism, that women are these sort of victims of male patriarchy. Probably one of the most popular versions of victim feminism that we see today is the Me Too movement, right? Is a variant of victim feminism. Also, there's things like critiques of female circumcision in other countries, or sort of like things like funeral deaths in India, and these things that get very like televised in the 60s and 70s and talked about in terms of other parts of the world, right? And how women are simply victims. Some of the hostility that feminists will have towards Muslim communities often is part of that. And the third wave feminists are often become somewhat critical of victim feminism. One is that one of the critiques that comes towards victim feminism from the third wave is that it often views femininity as a negative category. So, women are just sort of these oppressed people being taken advantage of. And instead, there's a version of feminism called girly feminism, which was a third wave feminist movement, and talks about basically that there should be this sort of celebration of femininity. That the feminine is something positive, not something negative. You also see this coming through, and this is very reminiscent of the standpoint epistemology stuff, that victim feminism often reinforces other sorts of differences. And you see that with a lot of the focus on third world countries coming out of victim feminism, or at the time, it's called third world, now it would be called peripheral countries. And so, basically what we end up doing is sometimes victim feminism falls into this trap of basically like accusing other people in other countries as being worse. And by focusing on that, they reinforce these sort of colonial differences, even if they're addressing differences in gender and power and gender. So they fail to understand that sort of place within it. So this is another good example of third wave feminism. So just to sum up, wave one, we have liberal feminism, which is voting, right? Which is the repealing of the Comstock Law, which is the right to own property. We have wave two, which is going to focus on economic relationships, these sort of long world views of relationships between men and women, some of which, more radical forms, are going to be somewhat separatist in its orientation, wanting men and women to live differently, right, and restructure and have sort of like alterations of familial roles, possibly overcoming the nuclear family. And then the other form is another form would be something like Marxist feminism, which once again is this long historical narrative about how is it that men and women are interacting with one another, and how is it embedded within these economic relationships. So second wave feminism, you start seeing something very sociological, right? It's focused on big structures, long periods of time. And you have third wave feminism, which is primarily just critiques of the other two. So that will round out our class. So thank you guys for all the great conversations we had before we finished, and went into all the great conversations we had before Shelter at Home. Thank you guys for continuing the work with the discussion boards, watching the videos. I'll look forward to seeing many of you on campus again, hopefully in the fall. I know Brenna's graduating, so congratulations. I think that's the only one of you guys that are senior. But Congratulations. Wish I could say that in person. Maybe this summer we'll actually hold a graduation ceremony if you know we go through the phases quick enough. If not, congratulations. Other than that, if you guys need anything, let me know. I'm always happy to help. Let me know if you need anything here in the 11th hour before we finish our last take home. Otherwise, have a great summer. Stay safe. Be healthy, and see you soon. Bye.